Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. Judaism and Christianity both consider the Old Testament, that's the first 3/4 of the Bible, to be divine revelation from God, the single God who created all things. Both religions are known for their commitment to monotheism, the belief in one God. At least that's the way they presented their idea of God. But there are a number of passages in the Old Testament that put forth the idea that other gods exist. Consequently, the ancient Israelites have been considered polytheists by many mainstream critical scholars. Monotheism, they say, evolved late in Israel's history, during and after a period called the exile. Now, if that's the case, that would make most of the authors of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, polytheists. Is that correct? Well, let's take a look. Now, the topic under discussion for today really isn't whether ancient Israelites as a population were polytheists, but rather whether the men who wrote the books of the Old Testament, were they polytheists? For sure, many Israelites in the masses were polytheistic. The Old Testament itself tells us that. It informs us of that fact in many passages and flatly condemns polytheism. I'm thinking of Numbers 25:2, 1 Samuel 8:8, Jeremiah 1:16, and a host of others. The question, therefore, requires more precision, more precise nuancing at the outset. Now, the Old Testament condemnations about other gods concern the worship of other gods. That's what the biblical writers are condemning. So maybe when we say that the biblical writers believed in God, in a God, what they're really talking about is that they only would worship one. Let's just store that in the back of our minds for a moment. Might Old Testament writers allow that other gods exist while forbidding their worship? If so, would the belief in the reality, the spiritual reality of other gods, would that really mean polytheism? After all, if you're a polytheist for real, it would make sense that you would be okay with worshiping other gods. Another question is, did the Old Testament writers see any one deity as unique? In other words, within the pantheon of all these other Elohim, these other gods in the biblical text, was there one that stood out ontologically, unique in his attributes? Now, whether you realize it or not, whether you worship other gods or see one as ontologically unique or not, matters when we're talking about something like polytheism. These ideas, these elements, these nuances are actually essential for our topic. Many Old Testament passages describe the God of the Bible as, quote, the God of all gods, unquote. I'm thinking of Deuteronomy 10:17, Psalms 135:5, 136:2. It also has phrases like the God of Israel being the king above all gods, Psalm 95:3. Now, the God of the Bible was said to have defeated these other gods, at least some of them, in famous Old Testament events like the Passover and the Red Sea crossing. For instance, Exodus 12:12, Numbers 33:4. Now here's the question. If there are no other gods in reality, these statements are basically meaningless. They're akin to saying that the God of the Bible is greater than fictional characters, something any living person today can claim. Or they're assigning a victory over an opponent that never showed up for the battle. Again, the statements would be meaningless. Further, the God of the Bible is said to be the master of the other gods, holding their fate and their very existence in his power. The classic text for this is Psalm 82. In Psalm 82:1, we see a heavenly meeting of gods, Elohim, presided over by the God, Elohim, of the Bible. The first verse reads, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, a key observation in Psalm 82:1 is the fact that God, capital G-O-D, is, as I've already suggested, the Hebrew word Elohim. But later on in the verse, the plural, gods, is also the word Elohim. You have Elohim occur twice in the same verse. The first time it's clearly capital G-O-D, and the second time it must be plural because we have in the midst of preceding it, in the midst of the gods. Now if we go down to verse 6, we see this again. The speaker in the psalm, who is the God of verse 1 presiding over this meeting, says to these other Elohim, I said, you are gods. There's our word Elohim again. Sons, plural, of the Most High, all of you. Now the Most High, to a psalmist, would of course be the God of Israel. That's God, the God of the Bible. And so these are sons of God, and they are called Elohim. We see sons of God in other passages like Job 1:6, Job 2:1. We know that these aren't men or idols either, because we see the sons of God in a heavenly council meeting in other passages, like Psalm 89, 5 through 7, where we read, for who in the sky, and in the heavens, is equal to Yahweh, the God of Israel? Who is like Yahweh among the sons of God, a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones? These verses, these passages are important. Even this little bit of an overview demonstrates that for Old Testament writers, there were other Elohim, other gods. But does that mean that the men who wrote these passages were polytheists? What about worship and the question of uniqueness? Would the psalmists have worshiped these other Elohim? Would they have seen one particular Elohim as ontologically, qualitatively unique? Again, these are the questions that really matter for this discussion. Now, the question before us is, does belief that other gods exist mean polytheism? Now, for modern people like us, it seems so. But we have to remember that monotheism is a modern term. It was coined in the 17th century. So that we have a sub-question. Can we use a modern term to describe an ancient worldview? Or is that sort of a mismatch? Now, while Old Testament writers believed other gods existed, they did not recognize them as entities deserving worship. In terms of their conduct, again, we're speaking here of the writers, they were not practicing polytheists. They had no time for other gods. Now, an illustration of why this is important and why the vocabulary matters and this sort of mismatch is easy to come up with in the modern world. Let's ask ourselves the question, is someone who believes in a spiritual world a spiritist? Here's one that's even better. If you believe in Satan, are you a Satanist? And of course not. These sorts of considerations, again, about the vocabulary and whether we can use a modern term to describe an ancient worldview, help us see that belief in other Elohim, other gods, doesn't mean necessarily at all that one is a polytheist, especially considering that Old Testament writers thought that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was unique. And what's really going on here is we're kind of trained by our culture. When we see the letters G, O, and D on a screen or on a page, our brains immediately say, there's a unique set of attributes that goes with the letters G, O, and D. But Elohim in the Hebrew Bible does not work this way. And we know that because of how the Old Testament writers use Elohim. They use that word to label a variety of different entities that are not the God of Israel. Sure, the God of Israel is Elohim. Members of this council are Elohim. The gods of the foreign nations in 1 Kings 11:33, for instance, are Elohim. Demons in Deuteronomy 32:17 are called Elohim. The spirit of the human dead is called Elohim in 1 Samuel 28:13. This ought to tell us quite sufficiently that a biblical writer, when they used the word Elohim, did not think of a specific set of unique attributes. Now, how does that help us, though, decide how the biblical writers really thought about their God? Well, their theology, their belief system about the God of Israel, doesn't derive from the term Elohim. Rather, it derives from the way they describe that one particular Elohim and deny the same qualities to all others. The God of Israel was all-powerful, Jeremiah 32:17, for instance. He is superior to all other Elohim, Psalm 95:3, Daniel 4:35, 1 Kings 22:19 makes this very evident. The God of Israel was the creator of all the other supernatural beings. Psalm 148, 1-5, and Nehemiah 9:6 makes that point. The God of Israel was the Elohim whom all the other Elohim were supposed to worship. Psalm 29, verse 1. In other words, Old Testament writers explicitly distinguish Yahweh of Israel from all other Elohim, all other gods. I'm going to read 1 Kings 8:23 to make the point. O Yahweh, God of Israel, there is no Elohim, there is no God like you in the heavens above or on the earth beneath. For you, O Yahweh, this is Psalm 97:9, are most high over all the earth. You are highly exalted above all Elohim, above all gods. Nehemiah 9:6, let's throw that in. You are the Lord, you are Yahweh, you alone. The host of heaven worships you. This is what a biblical writer believed. They believed in the uniqueness, the qualitatively superior nature of their God, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. They were not practicing polytheists. In fact, these words that we just read should show you very clearly that we don't have polytheism here. These are not the words of polytheists. And what we learn from all this is that Old Testament writers believed in many Elohim, a very animate, populated spiritual world, but that Yahweh, their God, was species unique, if you will. Yahweh was an Elohim, but no other Elohim was Yahweh. Believing in a unique deity like that and refusing to worship any other is not polytheism. But what about henotheism? Now, this is a term that says, well, you can believe in other gods, but you believe in one supreme God. Now, henotheism entails certain assumptions about the gods that Old Testament writers would not share. On the surface, the definition of henotheism sounds like it applies to what the biblical writers thought. But again, there are some other ideas that accrue to henotheism that they would have rejected. For instance, henotheism doesn't address species uniqueness. It makes no declaration about one Elohim being ontologically, qualitatively unique. Supremacy in henotheistic systems is typically about gaining that status, usually the result of social political factors, maybe a conquest, something like that. A henotheist would believe that the deity that was on top, that had the superior rank, could be displaced. That deity could lose that position. Winning status doesn't require uniqueness, and so henotheism, again, doesn't bother with that. Old Testament writers, though, are firm in their denial of these ideas. They do believe in the uniqueness of Yahweh, and they do not believe that he could ever be displaced or replaced. The famous Old Testament scholar H.H. Rowley, who wrote about henotheism, commented on what distinguished Mosaic religion, again, the religion of the biblical writers, from henotheism. He said this: biblical religion's emphasis was not so much the teaching that Yahweh was to be the only God for Israel, as the proclamation that Yahweh was unique. Again, all of these elements are important. What a biblical writer actually believed really sort of defies any one label. I like to say it this way. Again, Yahweh was an Elohim, but no other Elohim was Yahweh. And that one deity gets described in ways that no other Elohim ever do. And in fact, the biblical writers deny certain attributes to all other Elohim. So we're better off describing what a biblical writer believed than trying to stick a label on it. Now, a lot more could be said about this topic. I've actually written a great deal on it, and I have my own website if people are interested in specific details, thedivinecouncil.com. More evidence could certainly be marshaled, but our conclusion, again, is still sound. The biblical writers were not polytheists. Thanks for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our YouTube channel and watch more episodes, and visit our website for companion material to each episode. If you'd like to support what we're doing at Fringe Pop, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/FringePop321. And remember, what you know may not be so.